It's very important to understand the back of house in everything that you're doing. So, when you go to a hotel, there's an entirely secondary structure of floors, elevators, entrances, cafes that are necessary to support the front of house, which is the illusion of the hotel that you're staying in. We are complicit in our own deception. Otherwise, we'll never be seduced. And there's nothing more wonderful than a seduction to which we are willing and eager.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Drop the Mask. This episode is going to be a little bit different, but not really. I'm still breaking things down, doing my autistic thing, and correcting people when nobody asked. But I'm going to be revisiting my first bonus episode here with some new reflections about this current election. This is not just putting a new bow on an old gift. This is recut with a lot of new stuff. So even for those few of you out there who have seen it, this will be a whole new experience. And if you haven't been on my Locals channel, you can see the original there that I posted all the way back in September. I think it's some of my best work, so I couldn't keep it hidden forever. You could have been ahead of this, but don't worry, you're still early for the Drop the Mask train. There's no paywall for these bonus episodes, and you can follow me there for free. I've got the link in the description for you. If you do want to subscribe as well, there are some perks. You can see all my older episodes that I believe have aged quite well. I focus on ideas, and yes, there's some context around it that's topical, stuff that's in the news at the time, but I try to get into the concepts behind it rather than just tell you what's happening. Right now, I'm limiting the podcast feed to just the most recent 15 episodes. The rest you can find only over on Locals, and there are 2 other bonus episodes there for you to check out. I'm trying to get one a month on top of my normal episodes and interviews that come out on all the regular platforms. So pause this and go over to dropthemaskpod.locals.com and check it out. Anyway, that's enough of a plug, I think. I wanted to bring this interview back up because it's relevant in light of Donald Trump having been reelected just a few weeks ago. If you didn't see the bonus episode before, I'm breaking down a section of Eric Weinstein's interview on modern wisdom. It's all clips from the first 15-20 minutes or so of that show, which has a lot more great stuff, so go check it out. Since I stole some clips from it, I feel a little bit obligated to say, go find the whole thing and watch it, after you're done with mine, of course. It's definitely worth it. I think Eric is still clinging on a little bit to the state institutions, maybe a bit afraid of what would happen without them, and that's not completely irrational, but despite being a bit of a statist, he's otherwise very intelligent and fascinating to listen to for anyone who's intellectually curious. But in these clips, he's talking about how there's kind of an underground world government controlling things. He calls it the international rules-based order, and it's particularly nefarious because we don't know who these people are. Here's an extra clip that I didn't include in my original breakdown.
Right now, we have no idea who's running the United States of America. I just came here in a Tesla, and I did not steer once. And I would say America is in full self-driving mode, and we don't know what the AI is that's running the Oval Office. And that's really bizarre, given that we have something like 6 minutes to make a decision about nuclear launches. We have no idea what the United States government in the executive branch actually is. But it can't be Joe Biden.
America is, or maybe was at this point, in full self-driving mode, and not in a good way. The good way would be allowing freedom. People making their own decisions for themselves and having a choice to opt out when the people they hire to do a job for them don't deliver. That's the invisible hand concept that goes back to Adam Smith in the 1700s, who wrote about the success of free exchange and markets in The Wealth of Nations. He says that by acting with self-interest, free people are, quote, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. This is base-level economic theory, that those ends work out to be much more beneficial to society as a whole, because it's not introducing false signals that come with force and government intervention. But what we have now is the opposite. We have a hand that is forcing markets in the direction of the interest of a select few. This is what we call political solutions. Political solutions are completely at odds with freedom and prosperity. The economist Milton Friedman wrote about this in his book Free to Choose, that there is an invisible hand in politics that operates in precisely the opposite direction to Adam Smith's invisible hand. Individuals who intend only to promote the general interests are led by the invisible political hand to promote a special interest that they had no intention to promote. And I would quibble with old Milton there. I think very often politicians have every intention to promote special interests. That's like the whole selling point that they make. They appeal to specific groups and target them to try to alleviate their grievances, whether those are real or imagined. And okay, I think it used to be more that groups on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum were targeted because there's more of them, that'll get more votes. But now, the main purpose of our government seems to be to enrich themselves. And apparently, they have come to the conclusion that the most efficient way to do that is to start wars all over the world and then sell massive defense contracts and launder the money back to themselves that way. In fact, this political hand runs a massive black market. And you might think, wait, a black market is a free market. Yes, it should be, but they've twisted that term as well. They call free exchange, unfettered by their taxation and restrictions, black markets. But what they do is dark. They produce nothing. They operate entirely on stolen funds, building and selling weapons that kill millions of people, controlling the flow of drugs where it suits them, not to benefit the people and keep them off drugs, but to destroy entire communities and keep them down. They imprison people who resist too strongly. They do it to keep us down, and more importantly, keep themselves above us. It's the biggest black market of all. And so, we come back to the question, who's in charge of this? Like Eric said, it's not Joe Biden. It should have been obvious already that he wasn't mentally capable of such things, even before the dementia. But after they pulled off their coup and forced him out of the nomination from the Democratic Party, it should be 100% confirmed. The president does not run the world, and not even the country. Here's more from Weinstein.
There is something that I think Mike Benz is just referred to as the rules-based international order. It's an interlocking series of agreements, tacit understandings, explicit understandings, clandestine understandings about how the most important structures keep the world free of war and keep markets open. And there has been a system in place, whether understood explicitly or behind the scenes or implicitly, that says that the purpose of the two American parties is to prune the field of populist candidates so that whatever two candidates exist in a face-off are both acceptable to that world order.
So Eric talks about the rules-based international order, which is essentially American hegemony. This is the unipolar world that was initiated after the Allied victory in World War II, when the United States demonstrated an incredible and awful power by dropping 2 atomic bombs on civilians in Japan. The singularity of that power was cemented after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Now, I took some issue back in September with his comments about how this order is supposed to keep markets open and keep the world free of war. And I still take issue with it, but I think maybe I somewhat misinterpreted what he was saying. He's quoting Mike Benz on this, who worked in the State Department under Donald Trump and who has done a lot of research on where this supposed order came from. But he is saying it's an alleged order. The justification they give for it is that it's supposed to keep our fragile world spinning. But we know that's completely backward. If you understand politics and basic human action, you know that governments are the ones who make war, not people. People fight, but they generally know it's in their best interest to collaborate with people who are also willing to do so. It takes a collective mindset that comes with nationalism, with a government. It takes that collectivism to get suckered into wars. The tribalist nationalist mindset is one way to get there, but I think after World War II, the United States stumbled into this position of power over the entire world. And that is what we're talking about here. Power to control not just our own elections, but other countries' elections. We don't just hold the keys to our own car, but everyone else's. And if you don't play along, you're going to feel the pain of the world empire coming down on you hard. So we kind of know who it is. It's not just one person. It's not even a small group of people. It's the collection of intelligence agencies, giant media corporations, powerful lobbyist groups like Big Pharma, the military industrial complex, and yes, some of the politicians are in on it too. The international order is not a person, it's a system that wasn't necessarily planned by anyone. It's that negative, invisible hand that I was talking about. It just ended up this way, and because it was a series of events favoring special interests, those interests really won out, and that's why we have such bad income inequality, for example, for people that aren't producing anything good. But a very important part of the operation was to control who gets put up for nomination before the election happens. And that control lies in the duopoly of the two major political parties, the RNC and the DNC. The parties themselves have no legal authority to say what the law and policies are, but they all have the say in who comes out of the nominating process and who can be realistically elected as president. And I know I just said the president doesn't have the real power, but they do play a big part because people believe it. They have to. It's part of the illusion. And the president has to be willing to go along with it and not ask too many questions out loud. Let's hear more from Eric about what this order does.
So what you're trying to do from the point of view, let's take it from the point of view of, let's say, the State Department, the Intelligence Community, the Defense Department, and major corporations that have to do with international issues, from arms trade to, food. They have a series of agreements that are fragile and could be overturned if a president entered the Oval Office who didn't agree with them, and the mood of the country was, why do we pay taxes into these structures? Why are we hamstrung? Why aren't we a free people?
Yeah, so what this international order is afraid of is having someone come in at the head of the United States, who effectively runs the show, who is not amenable to that order, and starts asking too many questions. Questions like, why are we paying for this? Who put this in place? Why aren't we free to make our own decisions? Something like Donald Trump asking why we're paying so much for NATO, and why do we even need it in the first place? And with that understanding, Eric goes on further about what they're doing.
Every time it seems that an election has happened over the last decade or so, it's always been, this one is different, this is the most important, this is the most important. Is there something different about the one that we're about to go into? How should we think about this election?
As World War II unraveling, the order that has produced the illusion of peace for this length of time. Imagine that you were, let's say in the 2000s, that you had this thing called the Great Moderation. And there was a story that we had finally banished volatility from the markets. None of that was true. What you were doing was you were going farther and farther into a regime without understanding that sooner or later the Jenga tower has to collapse. The order that was put in place at the end of World War II, none of its architects are still alive. Very few pieces of information were passed down about what it actually is or how it functions because it's secret. And I think what you can say is that we are now living on the fumes built from that victory. That is what is unraveling. You're about to head towards a multipolar world where the game theory in a dyadic game of two players doesn't look remotely like the game theory in a 5 or 10 player game.
Okay, so he does mention that we have an illusion of peace. That's a little more in touch with reality. At least in the homeland, people are able to live their lives without thinking too much about the destruction that's happening around the world every day. But as I mentioned in my last episode, the US has been at war for 93% of its existence. Any peace we feel is truly an illusion. But here, he's talking about the fact that this order is currently in danger. I agree with that, and I do share some concern that if it collapses suddenly, that will cause a lot of misery and destruction. And if you just pull the rug out from under everything, it's going to be bad for everyone. I wish things could just change overnight and we could be free from this global empire, but people aren't ready. We've got used to our chains, and for a lot of people, we've grown to love them. Most people just aren't conditioned to fend for themselves. They want someone telling them what to do. And as long as they have that illusion of freedom, they're not going to question it. And I would say Eric's fears about this unraveling sound a lot like Chesterton's fence. This is an analogy that people may have heard about, But here's the original writing, so we get the full context. G.K. Chesterton says, "There exists in such a case a certain institution or law, let us say, for the sake of simplicity, a fence or gate erected across a road. The more modern type of reformer goes gaily up to it and says, 'I don't see the use of this. Let us clear it away.' To which the more intelligent type of reformer will do well to answer, 'If you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. Then, when you can come back and tell me what you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it.'" So I understand that perhaps there are things we don't know about why these systems were put in place. We can't know for sure if things might have been worse without them, and we should be careful in tearing them down. But my anarchist perspective is, of course, that this so-called order is not a net positive for the world. First of all, it takes place without anyone's consent. Eric even says, "We don't know who's in charge. The overall function of this order is a secret, and its architects have passed away." So this order has brought numerous wars to the world. And although we can keep up an illusion of peace at home in the US, that surely doesn't give comfort to the millions of lives lost or displaced in the name of maintaining this world order. There's no reason why their lives are less important than mine. It also takes advantage of those without power in the relationship, which in this case is like 99.99999% of people in the world. There is a group of people who fancy themselves elite, the managerial class, that thinks they can run the world better than people could on their own. And of course, they live in a parasitical relationship to us, thinking that they deserve to harvest our labor as tax slaves. Maintaining this power structure is very expensive. Even if you can somehow discount all the human beings it kills, it's leeching off the productivity of its citizens through the bastardization of the dollar, which, with its status as the world reserve currency, that affects everybody. Fiat money is probably the biggest thing propping them up. They don't even have to tax us directly. They can just create the money out of thin air. Before I go further, let's hear from Eric again. This is the clip that I opened the bonus episode with.
Fake news was a fake story. If you look at the Google Trends, fake news was a tiny story during the 2016 cycle that blew up immediately afterwards. It was the placeholder as the intelligence community or the blob figured out what it was going to do next to try to take control of the international order. You have to realize that that's the first real surprise in presidential history where they lost control of the process.
So this is a big part of why I wanted to revisit this content. It's directly related to the outcome of this 2024 US election, which everyone knows by now. Donald Trump won pretty decisively. This is one piece I want to reflect on because my position had been one of deep skepticism that he would be allowed to win. It's not that he's particularly good on most things. It's that the fits of rage that happened when he won last time showed us that the regime did not want him there. The news media, Hollywood, the FBI, the Democratic Party, obviously, and even the entrenched powers in his own Republican Party were outraged that this could happen. And they did everything they could to stop it and to brainwash people into believing he was the second coming of Adolf Hitler. And Weinstein called that 2016 victory a surprise to this cabal of so-called elites that constitute the world order. And I'm generally in agreement with that it was a surprise to them. And by the way, I'm going to refer to this world order as they or them, and no, it has nothing to do with transgender pronouns. But seriously, I think in 2016, it got away from them. They didn't expect someone like Trump. And for whatever bad there is about him, he's good at this game. And you would think after fortifying the election in 2020, as they readily admit, did they just forget to rig it this time? Or did something change? Or was I just wrong about some of my assumptions from the beginning? For those who don't remember or hadn't paid much attention to the details, let me explain the story. Taking it back to the primaries, that's where it started. Weinstein says that these are controlled processes, and I think that's right. They can say who even gets on the stage. They set up ridiculous monetary and voter support hurdles just to be included in any internal debates. But Trump has money, so it was just a matter of getting that support. And because of the personality that he is, he got it. It wasn't all there right away, and I don't think the RNC took him seriously enough to begin with. It looks like they just thought, oh, he's this big clown, he'll get us attention, but he'll never win. And so that was the first surprise. And by that time, it was too late to stop it. The DNC would have been different. I don't think Trump could have done this as a Democrat. He wouldn't have had to change any of his policies. They're all Democrat policies from 15 years ago. But the DNC is much more controlled because they have something called superdelegates. See, there are regular delegates who vote at convention for the nominee. They vote for who their state voted for in primaries. Superdelegates are above democracy. They can just choose whoever they want. They are unofficially the deep institutional leaders of the Democratic Party. They include former presidents, congressional leaders, and big money donors. They're about 15% of the total delegates, which means they usually have the power to tip any nomination in their favor. This is how Bernie Sanders got screwed out of the nomination in 2016. He was on track to win, but he, like Trump, is at least somewhat of an outsider. It seems like he's been subdued into playing ball with them lately, but that's not what we're talking about today. The established power did not want him on top, and they could stop it. So it's very ironic when you hear Democrats speak of democracy so highly and getting big money out of politics. They don't even practice that themselves. Their own nomination process is completely bought. And this year, they didn't even have one. Kamala Harris was not elected by primary voters at all, which, remember, she ran in 2020 and was deeply unpopular. She hovered around 1 or 2% among Democrat voters. But in 2024, she was simply selected by the party directly. No votes involved. But back to Trump. The RNC did not have this way out with him. They didn't have a superdelegate designation, so they were at the mercy of the voters. And Trump became one of two people who was now able to win the presidency. This is already a failure for the state. They're supposed to have two acceptable candidates, so they win either way. And now they find themselves with their chances of winning cut in half. But I think they were still confident in the general election, because all the polls were saying Hillary had it by a wide margin. Everyone thought it was in the bag for her. And of course, we know how that ended. Let's hear from Eric again and then get to what I said a few months ago.
So what the two parties would do is that they would run primaries. You'd have populist candidates, and you'd pre-commit the populist candidates to support the candidates who won the primaries. As long as that took place and you had two candidates that were both acceptable to the international order, that is, that they aren't going to rethink NAFTA or NATO or what have you, we called that democracy. And so democracy was the illusion of choice, what's called magician's choice, where the choice is not actually, pick a card, any card, but somehow the magician makes sure that the card that you pick is the one that he knows. In that situation, you have magician's choice in the primaries, and then you'd have the duopoly field two candidates, either of which was acceptable, and you could actually afford to hold an election. And the populists would vote, and that way the international order wasn't put at risk every 4 years, because you can't have alliances that are subject to the whim of the people in plebiscites.
Yep, he's back on track here. Absolutely correct. Democracy is an illusion, a false choice between two people who are pre-selected to be acceptable to the world order. Eric calls it a magician's choice, where they already know which card you're going to pick out of the deck. But something that he quickly mentions, and I don't want to skip over because it's important, is in every primary, they have all the candidates pre-commit to supporting the eventual nominee. It's something that I hadn't thought about really, but now when he says it, it's really hitting. This is a very common persuasion tool, playing on people's desire for commitment and to appear consistent. So candidates go in thinking they really have a chance. They take on this commitment to support whoever wins, believing that they actually can and should win themselves. Then, after the party plays their little shell game, even if they feel like they got scammed, it's really hard to go back on that commitment because they're afraid of what that does to their self-image. And this is where Donald Trump started to break things. He didn't commit to that in the primaries or in the presidential election. And that really freaked them out. But he was popular enough that they couldn't stop it without totally revealing the entire game. And if you want to get really conspiratorial, maybe they had to do something drastic like start a global pandemic in order to get back on top. But that's a topic for another day. So yes, democracy is not freedom of choice by any means. It's not ruled by the people. The system is gamed before we even get to the real election. But Eric points out that there are two different definitions of democracy that are at odds with each other. Let's see it.
Which is, it was a very immoral thing that was done to him. He was asked the question, will you pre-commit that you will accept the results of an election? Now, if you were going to rig an election, you would ask somebody that to begin with, and that's part of the game. And he says, well, we'll see. So you have this very strange thing going on where democracy is the greatest threat to democracy. Now, how can that be? It's two different concepts of democracy. One concept of democracy is the will of the people. You hold plebiscites. And even if you do it with an electoral college or political parties, the idea is that the people are allowed, by and of and for the people. The other idea of democracy is that democracy is about institutions that sprang from democracy once upon a time, and that those institutions have to be kept strong. Those are two completely different concepts that are overloaded to the same word. Under that circumstance, we have a paradox, which is how do we keep the electorate from overturning the type A democracy from overturning the type B democracy? And that's the unsolved problem that they will not bring in front of the people.
All right, so he's saying that democracy is two different concepts that are overloaded to the same word. These concepts are holding plebiscites, which is a fancy word for elections. This would be a pure democracy, where everything is done under a popular vote, including continuing existing systems and laws. The other is the institutions that democracy produced at some time in the past. And if I'm interpreting this right, Eric wants to make sure that the second type doesn't get overrun by the first. Here's the reverence for these institutions that was setting off the alarm bells in my head. First, we can go through some of the most obvious points anarchists will make about democracy, that it's the tyranny of the majority, that the idea that one-size-fits-all solutions must be adopted based on what your neighbors, let alone someone thousands of miles away, select on a ballot, is kind of insane. And that people cannot possibly be informed enough to decide on most issues, let alone all of them. And that in all likelihood, elections are rigged anyway, either by fixing votes or propagandizing citizens to vote in the elite's interest, as we just discussed. But aside from that, this smacks of social contract theory. This is the theory that we're all bound by some moral obligation to a group simply because we exist in that society. In America, this is the Constitution. I'm not saying Eric is advocating for this per se, but it does seem to underlie the concept that he's talking about. A lot of people in the libertarian anarchist world have refuted this theory, but you can find maybe the original from William Godwin in his work from 1793. This is also chapter 3 of the Anarchist Handbook that Michael Malice put together, by the way. But the idea is that we're born into this system, and we may benefit from it in some ways. But Godwin asks the question, who consented to this and how? Was it explicit, or is simply living in a place good enough to be implied consent? Did our parents, our great-great-great-grandparents consent? And if they did, does that mean we're also bound to this contract? Does that mean we can never opt for anything else? So just asking these questions already starts to answer the absurdity of such a social contract. It's a common tenet of American politics that it ought to be government by consent of the governed. But that is obviously not the world we live in. And Godwin concludes with this: if government be founded in the consent of the people, it can have no power over any individual by whom that consent is refused. So I'm not in favor of extending either type of democracy, but I believe that the entrenched institutions are what causes us to have little to no consent in the whole process. They keep going no matter what. But whether you qualify the outcome of this system as a failure or a success, Weinstein does recognize many of the problems that we're facing because of it. All right, I'm going to interrupt myself there again. I think we have a good understanding now of what's going on behind the scenes, how elections are fortified to make sure the regime stays in power, and some sense of who's behind it. So that brings us back to now, 2024. If this is how we understand the world, does what happened in this year's election fit that model? I want to be careful because, well, for one, I hate being wrong, and it would be really easy to just rationalize this away and not explore what seems like conflicts in the story. Just to recap, the hypothesis is that they didn't expect to have to cheat in 2016, so they let it get away from them. They really overcompensated in 2020, so much so that there are still a lot of questions about how legitimate that one was. Finding tens of thousands of votes for Biden in the middle of the night when no one was supposed to be counting and in the exact places where it was close and he needed them is a pretty big red flag, but I can't prove anything. It's possible people really were just pissed about the pandemic and thought he handled it horribly, on top of believing he's a Nazi and whatever else they like to say. I can at least imagine a reality where it was legit. So this time, it's clear the deep state, the world order, the regime, they, whatever you want to call them, they still don't like Trump. So I have a couple of thoughts of how he was able to get in. 1, there was too much scrutiny for them to rig it. So after 2020, they knew Trump's people would be everywhere looking for signs of fraud. If they get caught, it blows the lid off the whole illusion of choice. And that, for them, is much riskier than another 4 years of Trump. When they say that our democracy is so important, they really mean it. Democracy is how they justify their power. They need us to believe that elections are real and that by receiving 50% of the vote, you are now acting on behalf of the people. You're listening to their voice. Maybe I'm too deep in this crap, but God, it just sounds so ridiculous to me anymore. I really can't believe anyone buys it. But anyway, yeah, so maybe they had to let it happen, making the calculation that they can survive the next 4 years. After all, they were able to stifle him well enough the first time. And on those same lines, they could have been afraid of an actual revolt. Like January 6th, but real this time. They guessed that if Trump lost and there was anything fishy about it, his supporters would not believe it, and there would be riots. And I think that's not a bad assumption. Again, protecting that illusion is more important than losing 4 years by a long shot. The second thing that could be, they just did things behind the scenes to secure their hold over the controls. I don't believe for a second that these guys are going to just roll over and say, well, we lost the election, guys, time to pack it in. No, it's too big for that. They are not going to let go of such a massive power just like that. But if Trump is able to accomplish any of the cuts he's been talking about, I suspect they'll pretend to be defeated and then come roaring back next time they get a friendly candidate. Looking at his cabinet picks so far, I'd say we're in for more of the swamp. You've got Elon and Vivek running the Department of Government Efficiency, allegedly planning to cut things way, way down. Even Ron Paul's been rumored to be on board as an advisor. And RFK over the DHHS, which he's been very good about attacking the so-called public health regime. And Tulsi Gabbard seems decent. But beyond that, it's a big old swamp party, man. It's not giving me a lot of confidence. The other possibility is that it was never really rigged. And we're all crazy for even talking about it. Yeah, I don't think so. They don't have to cast fake votes to rig the game. That's kind of the whole point of this episode. They damned sure do it in other countries, so why the hell wouldn't they do it here? They are programming us for their ends, for us to be docile and go along. I think the reality is probably a combination of the first two things. They're forced to play the long game here. They're going to use the media to hamper him, maybe sometimes for the better, but mostly for the worse. Their main avenue of control is through the media, and here Eric talks about the concept of spackle, where they feed us a few lines that make the fiction seem real.
You're programmed client side at a subliminal level to be able to follow a film based on the idea that your brain is already tooled to absorb this stuff. There's a concept called spackle in Hollywood, where it costs a couple of lines to make something that makes no sense make sense. And so every once in a while, the craft pokes through. And so this is retcon is a back of house concept. And the issue, again, really comes back to professional wrestling. The smark is a smart mark, a person who is being duped and agrees to be duped, but has a metacognitive perch from which to watch his or her own deception. We are complicit in our own deception. Otherwise, we'll never be seduced. And there's nothing more wonderful than a seduction to which we are willing and eager. But this is an unwanted seduction. This is coercive.
Now we're starting to get into the media's role in all this. I did 2 episodes on this very topic. It's 21 and 22, about the regime press being the enemy of the people. Their job is clearly not to tell us the truth. It's to keep this international order in place. It doesn't matter that they are all blood-soaked monsters. They worship the order, and they crave the status they get as an arm of that monster. But he's right. People want to be seduced. They want to know they're being taken care of. And they will easily ignore things that don't fit into the convenient narrative because it's very uncomfortable. When you go to a movie, you know it's fictional, but you get sucked in anyway. You laugh and cry and identify with the characters because we're complicit in our own deception. We want it. But this isn't just a feel-good story with a happy ending like a movie. They're leading us to a very bad place. So what can we do about it? Well, you can speak up, like I'm doing now, but there are consequences.
They don't really, whatever it is not really trying to fool you. It's trying to instruct you. You're allowed to see the truth. They can make it difficult to find the truth, but it's hard to shut up Joe Rogan. They've settled for something else, which is, think about MSNBC and CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Reuters, AP, etc., as a set of instructions for how to keep your job. You're allowed to disagree. We'll set the boundaries of the disagreement. We'll set the topics of the disagreement. You may not even watch any of these things, but we'll make sure that it filters through to the people that you are watching so that they're outraged. And you're given a choice. You can choose to understand whatever you want, and you can choose to say whatever you want. But if you say what you understand to be true, you can know what the consequences are. You may lose your marriage. You may lose your job. You may lose your friends. And so, in essence, we all know that if you question the war in Ukraine, or if you say, look, I detest Donald Trump, but I'm voting for him because what's going on in the Democratic Party is unholy and insane, you're signing up for whatever Thanksgiving dinner we have planned for you. We're talking to your uncle. We're talking to your spouse. And in essence, this is a lot like Caligula installing his horse as a senator. No one's fooled that the horse is an ordinary human senator. The choice is, do you wish to say something?
This is the hardest part to swallow. In any government, I expect them to hide things. I expect them to be unfair. I expect them to act in their interests and not mine. I expect the worst, and often that's just what we get. But what they've figured out is that rule by direct force is not sustainable. When people know they're being controlled, then they have a problem with it. But when they think they live in a free country that is the force for good keeping the world right, if you question that, they start to get real mad. And I know, if you have even a little bit of dissident in you, you felt this. You've had the awkward or outright hostile dinner conversations. You've lost friends or been alienated from your family for seeking and telling the truth. I'm right there with you. It sucks, but I can't let it go. If you just want to go along and get along, then there are certain things they expect you to say and believe. And Chris actually demonstrates that in this next clip.
I don't know. I think it has taken a little bit of time. Maybe moving to America, seeing these things closer up has been part of it. I have a strong non-conspiratorial disposition, so I will always attribute to incompetence or negligence or fear of losing your job, cowardice.
You're running the packet.
So.
There's the lefty enervation packet, and it's something that you're sort of obligated to run if you're going to be a member in good standing of the American left. So one part of it would say that correlation does not imply causation. Data is not the plural of anecdote. Never explain by malice what can be understood through incompetence. There's a large sequence of things that you're expected to say if you want the pat on the back from your colleagues. A random walk down Wall Street. Nobody can beat the market. You know that there are rich people 3 doors down who got that way from investing, but they're simply lucky idiots. All of these things you're expected to run if you're part of the expert class so that the expert class doesn't turn on their masters. What it is a collection of safeties so that you don't use the tools of data, let's say, on your masters and attempt to convict them.
Chris got called out, and no shade to him, I've caught myself running these same scripts now and then, but Eric gets it just right. These are signals. These lines tell the ruling class that you're on their team, that you're not going to cause trouble. And if you want to be in that upper tier with these people, you have to use these. That's why they work so hard to keep people from saying anything that might disrupt their power. That's why Google and Facebook and all the big tech and media conglomerates will censor you and throttle your reach if you're not towing the party line. That's why they disparage the First Amendment at every opportunity, because that's a big inconvenience for them. Your speech is the only thing that keeps them in check. So my worry is not that this international order is threatened, and what chaos might ensue should it fail. No. My worry is they will squash the last bit of dissent that still exists and have total control over the entire world. I'm worried that they will get the full version of the Matrix underway, and we will literally be enslaved, while the elites live entirely off our backs. They already tell us, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. That doesn't sound like a promise of anything good. It sounds like a threat. Back to the present. The line, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity, is also known as Hanlon's razor. And it's a fair one, but it's definitely not always right. And because this international order is so big and convoluted, it's hard to tell who's acting maliciously and who are just the useful idiots. If we want to be generous, we could say that, okay, no one thinks they're doing bad. You could say they really believe they're helping and that they might have to do some unsavory things on the way, but the intentions are always good and they have a higher goal in mind that they honestly believe will raise the world up to a better place. But call me jaded, I just can't believe that anymore. Yes, there are some people like that who get caught up in it, but after decades of the same thing over and over, with obvious consequences that keep ruining people's lives, after 100 years of pointless wars that cause death and destruction that would be unimaginable to our ancestors, that goes on without a second thought today, that our leaders can continue to provoke and push without a single care for the millions of people that are ruined by this. I cannot accept that this is unintentional. And the cover that the media provides makes me sick. I've got one more new clip for you about that gaslighting that they try to pull off every single day.
This retconning, this mass lighting, gaslighting at global scale, it is mind-blowing to me that this is done on the internet when everything is held together.
Why?
Because the entire internet is obsessed with pointing out hypocrisy.
No. It's not the entire internet.
A large portion, a very vocal...
A large portion of very small accounts, a large portion of right-of-center accounts. Almost no one in what I considered my world does anything remotely like this.
Mm-hmm.
And good luck finding anybody who will believe almost anything that you tell them or will do so publicly. I took a tour through the East Coast, the corridor of great universities, from Massachusetts down to Philadelphia. And, I have many friends and colleagues in this departments, and they take me into their offices and they'd all close the door and they'd say, you have no idea how bad it is in here. And these are mathematicians and physicists, and they are living in a world in which it is simply too dangerous to dissent.
It's dangerous to dissent. People are afraid to speak up, but the more people do it, the more it will open the path for others. It doesn't take a majority to break the wheel. It just takes a few people to make a stand, to be persuasive, and give others permission to speak their mind. And if there's one good thing about Trump, it's that he's an interruption to the status quo. He fumbles and puts his foot in his mouth all the time. He's not a principled libertarian by any means. He's not going to fix the world. But it's a pattern interrupt that could get some people to wake up. He already has to some extent, so we'll see if that continues. I don't know what's going to happen in the next 4 years. It could be a prosperous time where the regime lays low for a while, recouping to come back stronger next time. It could be that Trump is captured, that he sold whatever may have been left of his soul and made some backroom deal with the man behind the curtain to cement his legacy. It could be that they installed enough insurance to keep him on the path while he still looks like the edgy populist and says crazy shit. I can't tell you, but I will say, whichever it is, they're not going away that easy. I'm allowing for a tiny bit of hope that there's some cuts, some reduction in the insane spending, that might also be a plot. Let him take the immediate pain that might come with it and take credit for the gains later. But to finish on a positive note, the one thing that I am hopeful about is that we won't be escalating more wars. Right now, the regime seems determined to stoke those flames in Russia and Ukraine, Iran and Israel, even China. But hopefully, we can hold on a couple more months without a major escalation, and we can wind down this nonsense. For whatever bad policy might come domestically, I really hope we can avoid World War III. Either way, I'll be here trying to get people to believe in themselves, not looking for anyone, especially government, to come save you. Throw off your chains, drop the mask, and things can be so much better for everyone. Thanks for listening. Again, go check out my locals page for more bonus content. I've got some extra footage from my last interview with Jack Lloyd that you can only find there. It's dropthemaskpod.locals.com or just click the link in the description. See you next time.